In 1844, on the edge of a mist-covered Louisiana parish, there lived a man whose very existence challenged everything the world believed about the human mind. His name was Daniel King, a slave with no formal education, no books, no teacher, and no freedom, yet possessing an intellect so sharp, so vast, so unexplainable that even the era's greatest scientific authorities whispered that he should not exist. Plantation owners feared him, scholars denied him, preachers warned that a mind like his could only be an omen, because Daniel could do things no enslaved man should have ever been able to do: solve advanced mathematical riddles in seconds, predict mechanical outcomes with eerie accuracy, and read unfamiliar languages as if some hidden instinct awakened inside him. Rumors spread like wildfire. They said he memorized entire pages of text after a single glance. They said he could reconstruct broken machines without ever having seen their inner working. They said he could calculate harvest yields, weather shifts, and even human behavior with a precision that felt closer to prophecy than talent. And the more he displayed, the more dangerous he became. Not because Daniel King was violent, but because he was undeniable, because he proved quietly, effortlessly, that the barriers the world used to justify slavery were lies. And in 1844 that made him the most threatening man alive. Whispers reached the ears of professors in New Orleans. A group of scientists, men who believed themselves the peak of enlightenment, traveled miles just to examine him like some sort of phenomenon. They asked questions, set tests, tried to trap him in intellectual knots, only to watch him unravel them with the calm of a man solving child's play. Their conclusion: not genius, not prodigy, impossible. But Daniel King had secrets of his own, truths he hid beneath obedience, truths that could collapse the Southern world if revealed. Because he was not simply intelligent, he was planning something, calculating something no one saw coming. And once the first piece of that plan fell into place, the entire South would tremble. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the plantation still slept under a blanket of fog, Daniel would slip into the corners of the estate that no slave was ever meant to see. He moved silently, as if each footstep had been calculated long before he took it, as though he'd mapped every creaking board, every loose nail, every spot where moonlight might betray him. It was in these hidden moments that Daniel's mind worked at its true capacity, freed from the chains of pretending to be ordinary. He had learned long ago that people feared what they couldn't explain, and a mind like his, sharp as shattered glass, fast as lightning, was the most dangerous secret he possessed. What started as curiosity turned into survival. One night, while delivering crates to the storage barn, he noticed a stack of papers left on top of a barrel, the ink still fresh, the handwriting unfamiliar. Something about the lines, the spacing, the structure pulled him close. He couldn't read at the time, not in the way literate men read, but symbols had always spoken to him. Shapes told stories, patterns whispered meanings, and as he studied the document under dim lantern glow, he realized it wasn't just a list of goods. It was coded, layered, intentionally structured to hide something. That night a spark ignited inside him, something ancient and instinctive, and it became the beginning of the path that would reveal everything buried beneath the plantation's surface. Months later, after teaching himself to interpret letters, Daniel began to understand the depth of what he had stumbled upon. He saw inconsistencies in the plantation's ledgers, strange imports and unexplained loss. He noticed the master's constant visits to the locked study and the guarded conversations between him and visiting merchants. He began piecing together the rhythms of the plantation, the comings and goings of riders, the shipments that arrived under darkness, and the heavy crates carried into the barn only to vanish the next morning. By the time he could read fluently, Daniel understood that knowledge was his only weapon. He started studying every scrap of paper he could get his hands on. Sometimes it was a receipt left on a table, other times a letter carelessly thrown into the waste bin. He could reconstruct torn papers, reassemble burned notes by examining the edges of charred fragments, and interpret patterns in handwriting to understand the emotional state of the writer. These weren't skills he had learned. They were instincts, raw and unexplainable, as though his mind was wired differently from birth. He learned where the master hid his keys, memorized which drawers squeaked, and identified exactly when the household fell into its deepest sleep. On moonless nights he entered the study, his pulse steady, his breath controlled. He never moved anything he didn't have to, never left fingerprints in dust, never disturbed the rhythm of the room. He read letters addressed to powerful men in the South and others written in languages he had never been taught, yet somehow he deciphered them, breaking complex sentences apart the way a mechanic understands the inside of a clock he has never seen before. Then one night, he found something that changed everything. A series of documents sealed with a symbol he had seen only once before, on the master's ring. These papers weren't about trade or harvest. They were reports, written in the master's tight, precise handwriting, detailing the origins of several slaves on the plantation, including one name that pulled the breath from Daniel's chest. His own. He wasn't born on this plantation. He wasn't even born in this. According to the papers, Daniel had been purchased at age 3 from a private auction not open to the public, one attended only by wealthy buyers with special interest. The document described the child him as displaying abnormal cognitive development, including early memory formation, unusual pattern recognition, and premature reasoning skills. The words felt surreal, as if he were reading about someone else. But as he continued, he found records of evaluations done on him as a young boy, tests conducted before he was old enough to understand what they meant, drawings, symbols, the arrangement of shapes placed before him, all recorded with uncomfortably cold precision. But there was more. A second document hinted that Daniel's parents were not ordinary, though no names were mentioned. It stated that the boy had been taken after an incident that left several men dead, and that the child was believed to be a product of something unstudied, potentially dangerous. Daniel reread the line 5 times, each time feeling the world shift beneath him. His entire life had been built on lies. Lies told by the master, by the plantation, by the system that claimed to own him. From that moment, Daniel's mission changed. He no longer sought knowledge for curiosity or survival alone. He needed answers. He needed to know what happened to his parents, why he was bought at such a young age, and what the document meant by calling him a prop. He began examining every record on trade routes, every merchant's log, every coded message sent to and from the plantation. He spent hours memorizing the master's correspondence, until he could mimic his handwriting perfectly, until he could predict the structure of his thoughts just by analyzing sentence patterns. Slowly, he uncovered the truth. The master had purchased him for more than labor. He had been purchased for observation, for exploitation, for the possibility that his mind could be used as a tool. And the moment the master realized Daniel's abilities were still growing faster than any child the master had ever seen, he stopped documenting him. He hid the reports, sealed them away, and pretended the boy was ordinary, hoping his secret would never be discovered. Daniel now understood that his intelligence wasn't an accident. He understood why the master watched him closely during his childhood, why overseers were instructed never to strike him too hard, why he was always assigned tasks that required thinking rather than brute strength. The plantation was his cage, but it had also unknowingly become his library, his training ground, his battlefield. Every night he returned to the study, gathering more pieces of the truth, storing information in his mind with perfect clarity. He memorized entire pages, recreated maps in the dirt behind the slave quarters, and calculated timelines with such precision that he could predict when the master would be away weeks in advance. And the deeper he went, the more he realized the plantation wasn't just corrupt, it was part of something much larger, a network of men hiding crimes so severe that even whispers of their exposure could tear the region apart. And through all of it, Daniel held the first piece of the truth about himself, concealed like a burning coal inside his chest, waiting for the moment he could use it. When word began to spread beyond the plantation, quietly, subtly, carried on the uncertain tongues of merchants and overseers that there was a slave in Landry Parish who could solve long division by sight, who could remember entire rows of inventory after a single glance, who could predict wagon breakdowns before they happened, the whispers eventually reached men who took such rumors far more seriously than the master could have imagined. These were scholars from New Orleans, men who dressed in tailored suits, and carried notebooks like weapons, men who believed they understood the boundaries of the human mind. They arrived unannounced one humid afternoon, stepping out of their carriage with faces that betrayed neither curiosity nor kindness, only calculation. The master greeted them with the forced politeness reserved for powerful visitors, but Daniel sensed the tension in the air long before anyone spoke. He felt it in the way the overseers glanced at him that morning, and how the master watched him from the veranda with a look that was not suspicion but anticipation. Something had been set in motion, and Daniel knew it involved him. He had prepared for this possibility for years, rehearsing expressions, limiting his displays of intelligence, choosing carefully when to answer quickly, and when to pretend to struggle. But the arrival of these men meant the danger had evolved into something far more serious. The scientist inspected the plantation first, as though every detail around them added to a theory only they understood. One pointed to Daniel as he carried sacks across the yard, and the master smiled politely, making a gesture for Daniel to approach. Daniel felt dozens of eyes watching him, slaves pausing mid-task, overseers pretending not to listen, the scientist sharpening their focus as though a specimen had come into view. They spoke to him like he was something unnatural. One asked questions rapidly, trying to confuse him, dates, numbers, distances. Another handed him a series of strange symbols drawn on a page, watching his reaction as though expecting awe or confusion. Daniel's heart beat hard, but his face remained calm, his posture obedient, his eyes lowered just enough to seem respectful, but not fearful. Inside, however, he was calculating. For every question asked, he delivered an answer slightly slower than his mind offered it, slightly less precise than he could achieve, intentionally flawed just enough to appear clever but not extraordinary. But the men were not satisfied. They asked the master for permission to evaluate Daniel more thoroughly. The master hesitated, torn between greed and fear. On one hand, if it turned out Daniel truly was exceptional, the master could boast of owning something rare, something that gave him unspoken power over his peers. On the other hand, if the scientists discovered too much, they might insist on taking Daniel away for study, and the master's pride would never allow anyone else to claim what he believed he possessed. Still, he led them into the shade near the barn, instructing Daniel to sit on an overturned crate. The men circled him like hunters around a trapped animal. One produced a pocket watch and told Daniel to explain how it worked. Daniel deliberately stumbled, describing only the basic mechanics, leaving out the intricate functions he had observed years earlier when he secretly dismantled a broken one in the master's study. Another showed him a paragraph from a French newspaper, and though Daniel could read it easily, he pretended not to understand one or two words, letting his brow furrow just enough to appear limited. But they were persistent. They switched languages, added numbers, drew diagrams, and asked him to interpret them. They watched his eyes, his breathing, the slightest twitch of his finger. They were not simply testing his knowledge, they were studying his reactions, evaluating patterns, measuring responses the way men analyze chemical reactions or observe rare animals. Daniel realized then that these men were more dangerous than the master. The master wanted control. These men wanted understanding, and understanding was infinitely more threatening, because once they understood him, they would never let a mind like his remain buried in the fields of Louisiana. They would take him apart piece by piece, strip away his humanity, and call it research. He had to disguise himself more carefully, so he began intentionally misinterpreting a few questions, offering approximations instead of exact answers, occasionally pausing and thought long enough for the men to exchange doubtful glances. He allowed small mistakes to color his responses, just enough to make them question the rumors but not dismiss them entirely. He played a role, within a role, intelligent enough to intrigue, ordinary enough to ignore. One scientist grew frustrated and switched tactics. He began speaking softly to Daniel, in a tone that suggested sympathy, asking how he had learned to think the way he did. Daniel kept his gaze low, pretending not to understand the question. When the man rephrased it, Daniel finally answered with a practiced lie. He claimed he picked up things by watching others, and had a good memory, nothing more. No mention of decoding secret documents, no mention of nightly study sessions in the shadows of the master's house, no hint of the true depth of his mind. The men scribbled notes furiously, whispering to one another in technical jargon. They conducted small experiments, hand-eye coordination tests, memory sequences, pattern recognition tasks, all of which Daniel performed at a level he carefully modulated. Too much skill would draw suspicion, too little would end the assessment too early. He needed the scientists to lose interest before they became obsessed, but not so quickly that they demanded further investigation elsewhere. Hours passed beneath the sweltering sun. The master grew impatient. The overseers shifted uncomfortably. The slaves pretended not to watch, though every eye lingered on Daniel, silently praying he would not slip. Finally, the scientists stepped away to confer privately near their carriage. Daniel kept his head down, but he listened. Their conversation was sharp, clipped, filled with frustration. They disagreed. One believed Daniel showed signs of unusual cognitive structure. Another insisted he was simply gifted for a slave. A third argued that the rumors had exaggerated everything. But what mattered most was the conclusion they arrived at. There wasn't enough evidence to warrant further study. They shook hands with the master, gave forced smiles, and returned to their carriage. Daniel exhaled only after the wheels cracked against the distant road. But beneath the relief, a deeper fear settled. The visit had proved what he had long suspected. The world beyond the plantation was beginning to notice him. And if the wrong people took interest, there would be no hiding, no pretending, no safety. From that day forward, Daniel vowed to walk an even thinner line, balancing intelligence and invisibility, brilliance and caution, using every ounce of instinct to stay one step ahead of those who believed minds like his were never meant to exist. Daniel had always known how to move through the plantation without being noticed, how to blend into the rhythm of daily life so seamlessly that no one questioned his quiet presence. But there was one person who saw more than others, an older slave named Abram, a man whose face carried deep lines carved by years of labor and secrets he refused to speak aloud. Abram had worked on the plantation long before Daniel arrived as a small child,
And unlike the others, he watched Daniel with an expression that wasn't fear or suspicion, but recognition, as if he sensed something familiar beneath Daniel's carefully constructed facade. It began with brief exchanges in the early mornings. When the field hands gathered before the overseers emerged, Abram would comment on the weather, the soil, the condition of the tools, but there was always something layered beneath his words, something testing, probing. Daniel noticed how Abram's eyes lingered on him when he calculated harvest weights in his head, or predicted the day's tasks before they were assigned. He wasn't judging him, he was studying. One night, when most of the quarters lay silent, Daniel found Abram sitting alone by the dying embers of the communal fire. The old man motioned him over without looking up, as if he had been expecting him. Daniel approached cautiously, knowing that every interaction, even harmless ones, could be twisted by the overseers into something dangerous. But Abram's presence felt different from the others, a quiet gravity that drew Daniel close. "You hear things," Abram murmured without lifting his gaze. "You see things too." Daniel hesitated. Admissions were dangerous, knowledge was dangerous, but lying to Abram felt even more dangerous, because Abram wasn't guessing. He was stating what he already knew. "I see enough," Daniel answered carefully. Abram gave a faint smile, not of amusement but of acknowledgement. "You hide it better than most, but I've been watching you since you was barely old enough to carry a bucket. A mind like yours don't come from nowhere.
Yeah.
It come from something." Daniel stiffened. The documents he had uncovered, the hidden reports detailing his origins, none of that had prepared him for the possibility that someone living on the plantation might know more than the papers revealed. He sat down slowly, the dirt cool beneath. "What do you think it comes from?" Daniel asked, voice low. Abram kept his eyes on the embers as he spoke. "Long before you came here, before Master bought you from that secret sale up north, there were whispered men visiting the big house late at night, men who didn't belong to no plantation business. They talked to the Master behind locked doors about a boy. Didn't say your name then, but said he was different, said he remembered things he wasn't old enough to understand, said he solved puzzles grown men couldn't." Daniel swallowed hard. So it wasn't just the documents. People had known about him, people had talked about him, and Abram had been listening. But Abram wasn't that boy, he continued, was said to be taken from a place where folks didn't survive. Something happened there, something they tried to bury, and the boy who walked away from it, some said he wasn't supposed to walk at all. Daniel's pulse quickened. The documents hinted at his parents and an incident, but they were vague, sanitized by academic language. Abram's words filled in the spaces with something heavier, darker. "How do you know all this?" Daniel asked. Abram finally looked up. His eyes were old but sharp, sharp enough to cut through any illusion. "Because I was here the day they brought you in. I saw the men who carried you. They looked scared." Daniel, not angry, not tired, scared, and men like them don't scare easy. Daniel felt the ground tilt beneath him. The memory was just out of reach, buried deep in the fog of early childhood. But Abram's words pulled pieces forward, flashes of light shouting, the smell of smoke, strong arms lifting him, a voice telling him not to look back. He couldn't see faces, but he felt the fear, the urgency, the sense of something ripping apart. "That's why I watched you," Abram said quietly, "not 'cause I feared you, because I recognized what the Master saw the moment you grew old enough to talk. You ain't like the rest of us, and I don't mean better, I mean different, dangerous, if you don't pick the right path." Daniel tensed. "Dangerous to who?" "To anyone who think they understand the world," Abram replied, "including the Master." From that night on, their conversations became more frequent but always subtle, always hidden in plain sight. In the fields, Abram would drop hints about the Master's movements, about the shipments that arrived unexpectedly, about the men who visited late at night. In the quarters he would share fragments of stories that the older slaves whispered through generations, stories of children born with strange gifts, of plantations that vanished overnight, of knowledge that white men
As the seasons shifted, Daniel's presence on the plantation began to ripple outward in ways he had tried desperately to avoid. It started with small things, simple predictions spoken under his breath, quiet suggestions he offered to other slaves when overseers weren't listening. At first no one realized what was happening. They thought Daniel was just observant, maybe lucky, maybe gifted with a kind of instinct some men were born with. But as his predictions continued to prove true with eerie consistency, people around him started depending on him without meaning to, turning to him before making decisions, trusting his judgment more than their own. One morning when the field hands debated whether a storm was coming, Daniel barely glanced at the horizon before he said the rain would break before noon, but not last past sunset. Hours later the sky cracked open exactly as he described. Another time the overseer insisted that the west field's yield would be poor and needed double labor, but Daniel told the workers to focus on the northern rows instead. When harvest came, the north produced double what anyone expected while the west barely produced enough to justify the effort. Word spread quietly, like water seeping through cracks. Soon the slaves were consulting Daniel before they chose planting spots, before they planned their hidden gatherings, before they made any move that depended on timing or outcome. They didn't ask him openly. They were too afraid of the overseers, but that found ways. A man sharpening his tools might glance over at Daniel and ask casually about the soil. A woman preparing to hide extra food might mention the guards' habits out loud, and Daniel would answer in a tone that sounded like idle conversation but was anything but idle. Daniel tried to slow the spread of dependence. He gave vague answers, pretended uncertainty, even walked away from conversations when too many eyes were watching. But it didn't matter. The slaves noticed patterns, and patterns were something no one could hide forever. They saw how Daniel looked at the sky, how he examined tools, how he watched people move. They noticed how he calculated without appearing to calculate, and they began to realize, even if they didn't fully understand it, that Daniel knew things no one else did, things that made their lives a little less unpredictable. But the person who noticed the change most sharply was the master. At first he didn't understand. He only saw the surface. The workers finished tasks faster, fewer tools broke under misuse, the fields produced slightly better yields despite the same weather and soil. It irritated him because he couldn't explain it, but he assumed it was luck, or discipline, or perhaps the overseers accidentally doing something right for once. Then he started hearing snippets of conversation. An overseer mentioned that the workers seemed to follow the quiet one. Another complained that Daniel seemed to know when inspections were coming, advising others without speaking directly. A third reported that Daniel avoided eye contact in a way that didn't feel submissive, but calculated, as though he were choosing which glances to allow and which to withhold. The master's irritation grew into suspicion. He began observing Daniel from a distance, watching how people lingered near him, how they listened when he spoke, how they borrowed confidence from his calmness. He noticed that the workers no longer waited for his instructions with the same anxiety. They didn't seem as desperate for the overseer's approval. They carried themselves with a strange quiet certainty, as though guided by an invisible presence that wasn't him. The master didn't understand Daniel's intelligence, not truly, but he understood influence. He knew the shape of it, the danger of it, the way it slipped beneath words and gestures until a man who once seemed insignificant suddenly held the strings of an entire group. He watched Daniel during a storm one evening, when lightning flashed across the fields and the workers scrambled to secure equipment. Daniel moved through the chaos calmly, giving short instructions to others, guiding them with quick gestures. The overseer hesitated, then followed Daniel's unspoken strategy, and in the end, Daniel's decision saved half the plantation tools from ruin. The master didn't feel grateful. He felt threatened. He confronted the overseers, demanding explanations, asking who gave Daniel the authority to direct anything. The overseers defended themselves clumsily, claiming Daniel wasn't directing, just helping, that he happened to be right often enough to earn a bit of respect. Their explanations did nothing to soothe the master. Respect was dangerous. Influence was dangerous. And a slave who could think ahead, a slave who could predict outcomes, was the most dangerous of all. The master started making unpredictable decisions to test Daniel's role on the plantation. He would change a work schedule at the last minute, shift responsibilities randomly, or give conflicting orders to see who the workers listened to. But each time Daniel adapted. The workers found small ways to reorganize among themselves, using subtle signs Daniel had taught them when he first realized they were relying on him. None of it looked suspicious on the surface. Daniel made sure of that. Still, the master sensed something beneath the calm. He began calling Daniel to the big house more often, pretending to need help with trivial tasks, moving crates, cleaning tools, just so he could observe him up close. He watched how Daniel studied objects, how his eyes lingered on details others ignored, how his posture shifted when he assessed a situation. The master caught himself wondering what Daniel was thinking far more often than he was comfortable with. One evening during supper, the master's wife commented casually that Daniel had predicted the rooster's illness days before it happened. The master froze. He forced a smile, dismissing her remark, but inside something hard and cold settled into place. The slaves weren't the only ones depending on Daniel now. Even the household had begun to see him as something more than a laborer, and the master knew what that meant. Influence wasn't just rising, it was spreading. He couldn't allow that. Not on his land, not under his authority, not from someone he believed he owned. So he started watching Daniel more closely than ever, sending overseers to follow him discreetly, ordering workers to report any unusual behavior. He pretended it was routine, but everyone felt the shift. The plantation grew tense. Conversations dropped into silence when the master approached. Workers avoided looking in Daniel's direction, even when they needed guidance. Daniel felt the pressure tightening around him, an invisible rope pulling closer with each day. He knew the master was becoming paranoid. He knew his influence had grown too visible, and he knew that one misstep, one display of intelligence too sharp, one prediction too accurate, could ignite the master's fear into something irreversible. But what the master feared most wasn't that Daniel was influencing the slaves. It was that Daniel was influencing the plantation itself, its rhythm, its success, its secrets, its future. Because a mind like Daniel's didn't merely observe, it altered things, shifted things. And the more people began to trust his quiet guidance, the more the master felt himself losing control of a world he believed was built on his authority alone. The weeks that followed brought a strange tension to the estate, a tension that rested on everyone's shoulders but pressed hardest on the shoulders of the young man whose presence had quietly upended the balance of the household. The owners of the estate believed they had complete power over every soul who walked its grounds, believed their rules were iron and their authority unshakable. Yet their control began to show cracks from the moment they realized how easily admiration shifted, how quickly whispers spread, and how fragile the pride of people could be when faced with someone they could neither intimidate nor fully understand. The overseers tried harder to assert dominance, barking orders louder, watching every gesture he made, interpreting any slow step or silent pause as defiance, even when he obeyed without complaint. There was something about him that made them feel watched in return, as if he carried a quiet knowledge they could not name, as if he saw straight through their bluster and into the weakness beneath it. They could push others around and feel strong, but pushing him felt like pushing against a wall that refused to give way, and that unsettled them in ways they tried not to show. The women on the estate watched him too, though for entirely different reasons, drawn not only to his appearance but to the calm presence he carried, a presence that made even silence feel like a story waiting to unfold. Some admired him openly, asking him to help carry baskets, or move crates not because they needed the help, but because they wanted a reason to speak to him, even if only for a moment. Others admired him in secret, glancing from windows or ducking behind curtains whenever he passed, their hearts beating faster from fear of being caught doing something so dangerous, for admiration in the wrong direction could become a weapon against them. Even the daughters of the estate owner were not immune, though each pretended otherwise, pretending the air didn't change when he stepped into a room, pretending they never lingered on the balcony at the exact time he finished his day's labor, pretending they cared nothing for the stories told about his strength, intelligence or quiet resilience. Yet their pretense fooled no one, not even themselves, and the tension in the household grew sharper whenever their father noticed the subtle ways their attention drifted. He himself remained aware of everything but responded to none of it. He had learned long ago that attention, especially dangerous attention, came with consequences, and he walked with the careful balance of someone who knew that every misinterpreted glance could ignite anger in men desperate to preserve their pride. So he kept his eyes lowered when necessary, kept his voice calm, and kept his thoughts hidden where no one could reach them. What he did not hide, however, was his natural kindness, the way he helped the elderly without being asked, the way he lifted burdens others struggled with, the way he stepped between cruelty and its target if he could do so without drawing too much notice. Many who lived on the estate began to rely on his quiet strength, trusting him not because he demanded trust, but because everything about him suggested that he carried integrity even in a place designed to crush it. But the more people trusted him, the more resentment bloomed in the hearts of those who felt threatened by his existence. The estate owner's eldest son, in particular, despised the way conversations shifted when the young man's name came up, despised how the workers lit up when he approached, despised that even the hired men who normally mocked or belittled others found him difficult to insult. To the son, it felt like losing control of something he believed he was born to command, as though the very presence of someone so quietly admirable exposed how little respect he commanded despite all his inherited authority. He began looking for opportunities to humiliate or punish the young man, fabricating reasons to call him out, exaggerating small mistakes, trying to push him into anger so he could justify harsher treatment. Yet every attempt failed, for the young man refused to react the way the son hoped, responding with patience instead of rage, calm instead of fear, dignity instead of submission. And the more he refused to break, the more the son seethed. Rumors began circulating that the estate owner himself had noticed the shifting dynamics. Though he said nothing openly, he observed his daughter's unusual quietness whenever the young man passed, observed the way the overseer's authority seemed less absolute,
observed how many of the laborers followed the young man's lead without being told. He did not care about the emotional turmoil in his household, but he cared deeply about control, and the idea that one man he believed should have had no power at all, could disrupt the equilibrium of his property unsettled him in ways he did not admit even to himself. He tried re-evaluating the young man from a distance, watching for arrogance or rebellion, trying to find flaws he could point to, but every observation left him more frustrated, for the young man worked harder than most, spoke less than most, and maintained a discipline that no punishment could improve upon because it did not come from fear, but from inner steadiness. Still, the tension kept building, thicker each day, as though the estate itself sensed that something inevitable was approaching, something that had been set in motion the moment the young man arrived. Even nature seemed to whisper it, wind carrying murmurs through the cane fields, nights more still than usual, animals pausing as if listening for something beneath the surface of the ordinary. The air felt charged in a way that made people uneasy, as though they all sensed that nothing on the estate was as stable as the owners wished to believe. Conversations grew quieter, glances sharper, footsteps more cautious, and even laughter seemed hesitant, like it knew it had no place in the heaviness settling over the land. Through it all, the young man continued his work without complaint, yet he felt the shift as clearly as everyone else. He could feel eyes on him wherever he went, some admiring, some curious, some hostile, and some frightened of what his existence meant for them. He knew that jealousy was growing among the men in power, knew that fear was growing among the workers who depended on him, knew that longing was growing among those who admired him in silence. And he understood that such mixtures rarely stayed contained forever. Something in the wind told him that the fragile order holding the estate together was beginning to fray, thread by thread, and that his role in its unraveling was no longer avoidable, whether he wanted it or not. As the tension across the estate thickened, his awareness of the shifting atmosphere grew sharper with each passing day, though he never spoke of it aloud. The smallest movements around him began to take on new meaning, like pieces of an unseen pattern trying to reveal themselves. The workers who once greeted him with easy nods, now cast cautious glances toward the overseers before offering a word. The whispers that used to drift freely through the quarters at night became quieter, shorter, fragmented by fear of being overheard. Even the sound of footsteps carried a different weight, as though every person on the grounds had become hyper-aware of how quickly a single misstep could trigger consequences no one wanted to face. The estate itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something it sensed long before any of the people did. He moved through this shifting world with a calm that masked the storm in his thought. At the start of every dawn before the estate fully awakened, he would stand outside and watch the sky lighten behind the treetops, using those few minutes of solitude to gather whatever strength he would need for the day. It was in those moments he could feel the heaviness in the air most clearly, as though the land was trying to warn him of changes coming in slow, inevitable waves. The wind carried faint echoes of unrest, the soil felt unsteady beneath his feet, and even the birds seemed to fly in patterns that hinted at disturbance. He did not believe in omens, yet everything around him suggested that nothing on the estate was as stable as it had once seemed. The overseers noticed the shift too, though they misinterpreted it. To them, the growing quiet was evidence that the people were becoming restless, that the workers were planning something, that someone, perhaps him, was influencing them in ways they could not control. The idea that one man through nothing more than his presence could disrupt the hierarchy terrified them more than any threat of rebellion. So they tightened their control, issued harsher orders, watched every gesture and breath with suspicious eye. They believed that pressure would restore order, that fear would drown out admiration, that punishment would silence the undercurrent of unity they sensed but could not define. Yet their actions only thickened the tension, feeding the very unrest they hoped to smother. The estate owner's eldest son became the most volatile presence in this growing struggle, consumed by a jealousy that gnawed at him from the inside. Each day he watched the young man work with unwavering stamina, watched workers gravitate toward him even without speaking, watched how the household shifted its mood depending on whether he was present or absent. Jealousy turned into obsession, and obsession into a quiet rage that simmered just beneath the surface of every word he spoke. He began inventing reasons to target him, pushing him harder than anyone else, searching for even the slightest mistake that could justify punishment. But the young man remained steady, refusing to give him the reaction he desired, refusing to hand him the satisfaction of seeing defeat in his eyes. Meanwhile, the estate owner's daughters walked through their days pretending not to notice the tension, though their careful gestures revealed more emotion than words ever could. They avoided standing too close to windows when he passed by, avoided lingering in rooms where he worked, avoided addressing him too directly even when necessity demanded it. But their avoidance was not indifference. It was protection from their father's eyes, from their brother's suspicions, and from the way their own hearts responded whenever he stepped into a room. Their silence became a shield they held tightly, Yet the shield did nothing to hide the way their expressions softened in his presence, or the way their voices changed when they spoke of anything connected to him. Inside the workers' quarters, conversations that once revolved around daily tasks turned into quiet discussions about possibility, hope and danger. Some believed the young man's strength, both physical and moral, was a sign that change could come, that perhaps there existed a future where the rules that dictated their lives could be broken. Others feared that simply being associated with him could bring punishment onto them all. A few were torn between admiration and fear, wanting to believe in something greater but knowing the consequences of hope in a place where hope itself was treated like rebellion. Yet even the fearful could not deny that his presence made them stand taller, breathe steadier, and feel, if only briefly, like they were not alone. He sensed all of this, though he spoke of none of it, aware that words had the power to ignite fires he was not ready to start. Instead, he focused on doing what he could within the limits forced upon him, helping those who needed help, standing in front of cruelty when he could do so without creating chaos, listening to those who needed to speak but had no one else to confide in. His silence was not weakness but strategy, a way of preserving himself and others in an environment designed to break anyone who stood out too boldly. He carried himself like a man walking across a frozen river, assessing every tread, every shift in the ice, every sound that hinted at cracks below. The estate owner kept his distance outwardly, though his attention was fixed sharply on the growing imbalance within his household. He watched the patterns of movement across the grounds, watched the subtle ways authority wavered, watched his son's temper flare more often, watched the unsettled expressions of his daughters when certain subjects came up at dinner. He saw all of it, even if he pretended not to. And beneath his outward calm, a fear grew that he refused to say aloud, the fear that control, the foundation of his world, was slipping, not because of rebellion, not because of outside threats, but because of one man who had never raised his voice, never broken a rule, never shown defiance. The fear of losing control to someone who seemed to hold power without trying was a fear he did not know how to address. As days folded into weeks, the quiet unease became an unspoken presence that followed everyone. Nights grew heavier, filled with distant sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else. Workers found it harder to sleep. Overseers found it harder to ignore their own anxiety. Even the animals sensed the tension, growing skittish at random moments, pausing mid-step as though listening for something just beyond hearing. Conversations became shorter, footsteps quieter, and every action felt wrapped in caution. The estate felt like a vessel carrying too much weight, drifting toward a storm no one had named. Through it all, the young man continued to move with the same steady rhythm, though inside he felt the growing vibration of something approaching. He could not yet see the shape of what was coming, but he felt its presence building in the air, gathering force in the tension that coiled through every corridor and field. He knew that balance was shifting in ways that could no longer be ignored, that the fragile lines drawn between admiration and danger, between jealousy and fear, between authority and instability, were beginning to blur beyond repair.
The coded ledger lay hidden beneath locked drawers and false-bottomed cabinets for years, guarded as carefully as a man might guard his final breath. No one on the estate was ever meant to see it, much less understand it. The overseers themselves did not know the full truth of what it contained. Even the master's sons had only glimpsed the leather-bound book once or twice in childhood, when their father believed they were too young to understand what they were seeing. The book represented the lifeblood of the plantation, the secret dealings that kept the estate wealthier than it appeared, the transactions that broke laws even other plantation owners hesitated to test. For years the master trusted that no one under his authority could ever read it, let alone decipher what lay inside. Yet the man who was never supposed to touch it found himself standing over it one night, the lamplight flickering across the strange symbols like a silent invitation. He hadn't meant to find it. He had only meant to deliver a repaired hinge back into the master's office, a task he performed with quiet efficiency to avoid attracting attention. But while placing the hinge on the desk, the faint click of shifting weight caught his ear, something delicate sliding slightly out of place within the drawer. It was the kind of detail most would miss, a whisper of motion softer than a page turning. But his mind caught it instantly, and when he gently pressed the side of the drawer, feeling it give way more than it should, he realized there was a hidden space. His breath steadied, and he waited, listening closely for footsteps. but the house was deep in evening quiet. Curiosity and calculation moved him in equal measure as he slid the drawer open just enough to expose the hollow compartment. The ledger waited inside like a secret begging to be unburied. He lifted it only halfway out at first, studying the cover. It was older than the room it sat in, older than the plantation itself. The leather cracked and darkened by age. His fingers traced the faint carvings along the spine, not letters but symbols, the kind a scholar might have recognized but that had no business being in the possession of a plantation owner who would barely sign his own name. The markings hinted at a different origin, perhaps copied from foreign traders, perhaps learned from someone far more educated than the master claimed to be. He hesitated, knowing that even touching it was a risk, but the weight of the book seemed to draw him deeper, urging him to open it. And when he did, the pages revealed a labyrinth of encoded entries, none written in a straightforward hand. Most people would have seen nonsense. Lines of slanted symbols, odd spacing, seemingly random letters scattered among numbers, but to him, patterns revealed themselves immediately. His mind registered repetitions, mirrored structures, symbols appearing at deliberate intervals. He felt his pulse tighten with the familiar sensation he experienced whenever he encountered a problem built on hidden logic. The code was not there to confuse someone like him. It was there to keep ordinary eyes blind, and he was far from ordinary. As he turned the pages, he felt the structure of the cipher unravel beneath his gaze, each inconsistency pointing to a deeper rule, each repeated mark revealing part of the underlying pattern. The master had believed the code was unbreakable because no one on the estate possessed the intellect to challenge it. Yet in the span of minutes, the first layer had already begun to fall apart. He could not take the book with him. He could not risk leaving a trace. So he memorized it, line by line, page after page, symbol after symbol, until his mind held every piece as clearly as if the pages were still open in front of him. His ability to recall information with perfect accuracy had always been something he used carefully, never demonstrating it outright, never allowing overseers or other workers to see how much he could retain after a single viewing. But now he let that hidden skill expand without restraint. The book contained years of transactions, shipments listed only in symbols, names disguised beneath mathematical substitutions, payments funneled through foreign intermediaries, whose identities were masked behind the code. The deeper he read, the clearer it became that the ledger was not merely a record of illegal trade. It was a map of a network stretching far beyond the plantation. He discovered entries referencing exchanges with men in distant ports who had been banned from southern trade. He saw coded acknowledgments of bribes paid to local officials, ensuring shipments arrived uninspected. He decoded references to human trafficking operations conducted under false flags. People traded after midnight in secluded fields disguised as equipment delivery. The ledger was a confession, a detailed chronicle of criminal enterprise woven so deeply into the plantation's wealth that exposing it would collapse not only the estate, but half the men the master did business with. Every page was a revelation showing him just how corrupt the foundation of the household truly was. The more he read, the more he understood that the master feared discovery not because the law was just, but because the power he wielded relied on secrecy. The estate had always seemed more prosperous than others in the region, but now he understood why. The ledger explained the sudden influxes of money, the unexplained expansions, the rapid acquisitions of land from neighbors who mysteriously went bankrupt. The master was not merely a man of wealth. He was a man who ensured his success through deception, bribery and exploitation, masking itself behind the facade of southern respectability. After memorizing the final encoded page, he carefully returned the ledger to the hidden compartment, sliding it back into place with the same precision he had used to remove it. He wiped away the faintest trace of dust disturbed in the process, ensuring that no evidence remained of his discovery. Yet as he stepped back from the drawer, the weight of what he had learned pressed against his chest, not as fear but as possibility. Knowledge of this scale was power, and in his hands it could become a weapon capable of shifting the balance of everything around him. The ledger was not simply a document. It was the plantation's Achilles heel, a weakness hidden in plain sight, that he now carried with perfect clarity in his memory. Leaving the office, he moved silently through the corridor, replaying every detail of the cipher in his mind, organizing it, categorizing it, shaping it into a tool he could later use. He walked past the faint glow of lamps, past the quiet rooms where the master's family slept, unaware that their most valuable secret no longer belonged solely to them. He stepped outside into the cool night air, letting the darkness envelop him as he made his way back toward the quarters, every step guided by the rhythm of information still flowing through his thought. The sounds of the night seemed sharper, the air heavier, as if the world itself sensed that something beneath the surface had shifted, and though no one around him knew it yet, the knowledge he carried had the power to unravel everything the master had built, piece by piece, without a single blade being drawn. The first rumors drifted out quietly like loose threads carried on the wind, whispered by field hands who crossed the borders between plantations during shared tasks or nighttime gatherings. At first they were only fragments of conversation, mentions of a man who could outrun problems with his mind instead of his feet, A man whose presence alone unsettled overseers. A man who seemed to be thinking of something far larger than the life forced upon him. No one knew his name at the beginning, only that on one particular plantation, someone had become the subject of hushed discussions that grew louder with each passing week. Stories traveled in pieces, stitched together by those who overheard bits of talk from drivers, traders, or household slaves who visited neighboring estates. The truth in these stories shifted like smoke, gaining shape, losing shape, growing more mysterious the farther they traveled. Soon, neighboring plantations began to feel the weight of the whispers. Workers returning from errands would speak in low tones about strange happenings, unexplained tension among overseers, unpredictable movements of patrols, secret meetings held by plantation owners deep into the night. Some blamed weather, others blamed politics, but many suspected that the real cause was the unsettling presence of someone whose mind moved differently than any man they had ever known. Even those who had never seen him began to invent details, imagining a figure so sharply aware that he could see danger coming before it was even formed. Imagination blended with truth, until the stories became something no one could fully dismiss. Slave catchers, who made their living by tracking escapees or quelling unrest, noticed the shift in atmosphere too. They always knew when the energy of the land changed. Rumors fed their business, and fear drove their authority. When whispers of an impossible mind reached their ears, they grew tense. A man who could inspire workers without speaking. A man who could disrupt systems without lifting a weapon. A man who understood things he had no right to understand. This was more dangerous to their livelihood than any runaway. To them, intelligence was a threat more potent than rebellion. Because intelligent men didn't simply run, they changed the rules of running. So slave catchers began to visit the surrounding plantations more frequently, asking questions disguised as casual conversation, observing workers more closely, pressing overseers for information they weren't sure how to provide. In taverns where patrolmen gathered after long rides, the stories expanded with every retelling. Some claimed the man could read documents upside down from across a room. Others said he could predict weather patterns days before storms arrived. A few swore they heard that scientists from the city had already examined him like some rare artifact of nature. The more unbelievable the tale, the more eagerly it spread. Humans were drawn to the extraordinary even when the extraordinary terrified, and each exaggerated detail only made the real man who had never asked to be the subject of these tales seem more mythical and more dangerous. The plantation owners closest to the estate grew uneasy. They trusted order, structure, predictability. A man whose mind unsettled those around him threatened everything they believed kept their world intact. Some suspected he was plotting something. Others feared he might inspire their own workers to think beyond the boundaries of their enforced role. A few demanded private meetings with the master of the estate where he lived, hoping to learn whether the stories were exaggerated or alarmingly true. The master offered vague reassurances, insisting that his workers were under control, that nothing unusual was happening. But the tightness in his voice and the flicker of anxiety in his eyes told a different story. Plantation society thrived on facade, and this moment was no exception. Among the workers on those neighboring lands, hope flickered quietly. Even those who had never seen the young man felt something stir inside them when they heard his story. The idea of a slave so intelligent that even educated men feared him cracked the foundation of everything they had been told about themselves. For generations they had been taught that their minds were inferior, that they were meant to follow rather than lead, that their purpose was defined by others. But now finally a story suggested otherwise. It suggested that brilliance could exist in places where no one bothered to. It suggested that potential was not restricted to the privileged. And most importantly, it suggested that freedom could begin in the mind long before it reached the body. Some whispered his story like a prayer, invoking his name without ever having spoken it aloud before. Others feared the consequences of believing too deeply in something they could not see. But even the fearful felt the shift. Something was changing in the fields, in the quarters, in the quiet corners where exhausted workers gathered after. Something felt possible, even if no one knew what that something was. The mere idea of his existence created ripples that spread farther than any action he had taken. His silence, his caution, his attempts to avoid attention did nothing to stop the wave of influence that grew around him. Back on his plantation, the shift in outside attention did not go unnoticed. Overseers became more irritable, more suspicious, more violent with smaller provocation. They sensed eyes on them from beyond their property lines, as if every mistake could be used against them by men from neighboring estates. The master began receiving unexpected visitors at dawn, men who arrived unannounced demanding answers wrapped in polite phrases. His sons grew restless, unsure why the household had suddenly become a point of interest. And through all of this, the man at the center of the storm remained quiet, going about his tasks while observing everything with the same calm precision he had always kept. But he could feel the eyes watching him from places he could not see. He noticed the increase in patrols along the surrounding woods,
The way riders no longer moved leisurely but scanned every shadow as though expecting trouble. He heard the murmurs in the quarters about strangers asking questions. He sensed the tension among workers who feared they might be punished simply for knowing him. He understood that the stories spreading beyond the plantation were painting him as something he had never claimed to be, someone extraordinary, someone unpredictable, someone worth fearing or following, depending on who heard the tale. His rational mind warned him this attention could be dangerous. Increased scrutiny meant fewer places to move without being watched, fewer conversations that could happen without being overheard. But another part of him recognized the rare power in what was happening. Influence had been thrust upon him not through intention but through truth. His existence alone was reshaping how people thought. He knew that influence could be used carefully, subtly as a tool that no overseer could confiscate. Yet he also knew it could become a blade turned against him if he wasn't careful. Every rumor, every whisper, every exaggeration tightened the net around him a little more, even as it loosened the mental chains of countless others. As the weeks stretched on, the air across neighboring plantations continued to shift. The ground felt charged with anticipation. Workers behaved differently, carrying strength in their steps they hadn't realized they possessed. Overseers became more rigid, like men bracing for a storm without knowing its source. Slave catchers lingered longer than necessary, watching the roads, waiting for a sign that the stories had crossed from rumor to reality. The surrounding fields, forests and roads all seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something beneath the surface had begun to stir in ways no one could undo. The patterns of the estate had grown so predictable that even a casual observer could chart the days, the labor, the schedules with minimal effort. Yet he moved through them as though the rules themselves bent beneath his understanding, slipping through the cracks that others failed to notice, observing connections that no one else could see. Each morning began with the same tasks: fields to be tended, tools to be prepared, livestock to be checked. But within the routine he discovered variables hidden beneath appearances. Soil that seemed uniform held pockets of unexpected fertility. Water channels that appeared dry at dawn would swell by midday in ways that no ordinary calculation could explain. Overseers who seemed inattentive actually left subtle cues in the arrangement of the field, and he absorbed every detail, every nuance, every hidden rhythm, storing it in his mind as though the estate itself were a puzzle meant only for him to solve. The complexity of the system became apparent when he began predicting outcomes that no one else would have considered. A rainstorm that threatened the southern fields could be anticipated not by watching the sky alone, but by noting the humidity in the morning, the behavior of insects in the marsh, and the distant smell of earth carried on the wind. He warned others subtly, never loudly, always in ways that could be explained away as coincidence or careful observation. When the harvest exceeded expectations despite erratic weather, the overseers credited luck, unaware that someone among them had read the patterns of nature like an open book. The laborers began to trust his guidance without realizing it, adjusting their work according to hints he offered in passing. The ledger he had memorized months earlier now returned to his thoughts with every calculated decision. He could recall shipments, codes, and secret arrangements as easily as he could predict soil fertility or animal behavior. He began linking these two realms, the practical rhythms of the estate, and the hidden commerce beneath it, seeing the ways one influenced the other. If the master received an unexpected shipment, he could determine its contents based on the arrival time, the weight of the crates, the coded instructions previously observed. If a tool broke in the workshop, he could deduce which worker had used it last and what adjustment to make to prevent a recurrence. Knowledge became his currency, though it was invisible, intangible, yet infinitely more valuable than the coins hidden in the master's safe. Other slaves began to notice, though they did not know how to articulate it. Small victories emerged quietly: a harvested crop saved from spoilage because he suggested a change in stacking, livestock rescued from sickness because he noted an unusual behavior, a shipment arriving intact despite the weather because he advised a minor re-. These successes drew quiet admiration, the kind that spread without words and without formal acknowledgement. People began to anticipate his guidance, seeking his opinion in subtle ways: a glance, a tilt of the head, a question phrased as casual curiosity. They did not realize they were relying on him, yet the pattern of dependence grew steadily, like a shadow lengthening with the passage of the sun. Meanwhile, the master's scrutiny intensified. He could not name the source of his discomfort, but he sensed a disturbance in the harmony he thought he controlled. He watched the interactions between the laborers and the young man, noticing small changes: the hesitation before answering questions, the way the workers subtly aligned their tasks to his recommendations, the careful attention paid to his every movement. The master, accustomed to unquestioned obedience, felt a sense of unease he could not define, a tension that tugged at his pride and authority. It was as if the young man had become the quiet pivot around which the estate rotated, invisible yet indispensable, and the master resented every moment of it. His own family experienced similar shift. The daughters who had tried to remain indifferent, now found their daily routines touched by his influence in ways they could neither ignore nor control. Their attention, whether drawn by curiosity or admiration, could not be hidden entirely. Even the son, whose attempts to dominate him had failed, found the atmosphere of the estate subtly altered by his mere presence. Tasks that once relied on coercion now flowed with a strange efficiency that neither punishment nor reward could fully explain. The young man's intelligence reshaped not only the outcomes of daily work, but the behavior of those around him, creating an invisible order stronger than any chain or overseer could enforce. As he moved through the estate, he began to see larger patterns that suggested a network far beyond the property line. The coded ledger was not just a record of transactions, it was a key to understanding the flow of power, money, and control across plantations, towns, and distant ports. Connections between shipments, financial arrangements, and the placement of workers revealed a system so vast and intricate that few could imagine it. And he, through memory, observation, and logic, began to trace it thread by thread, discerning the rules that governed behavior, predicting movements of goods and people, understanding the hidden strategies of men who believed themselves untouchable. The knowledge he carried became more than a tool for survival. It became a way to influence outcomes, subtly shift balance, and protect those who relied on him. He guided the laborers in ways that minimized punishment, optimized harvests, and maintained efficiency, all while remaining invisible to the master's direct scrutiny. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act openly and when to let subtlety carry the message. Every success was unspoken, every victory concealed beneath the normal rhythm of estate life, yet each one strengthened his understanding of the intricate systems around him. The overseers grew increasingly frustrated as their authority was undermined without overt challenge. They barked commands, watched closely, and attempted intimidation, yet nothing they did could fully control the outcomes. Tools repaired according to his advice lasted longer, fields tended as he instructed flourished, livestock thrived under adjustments he suggested. Their repeated failures to assert dominance only heightened tension, creating anxiety that made small mistakes more frequent, further revealing their lack of absolute control. The young man's presence and intelligence became a subtle force reshaping the hierarchy, a silent power that threatened those who had believed themselves untouchable. Even the master began to notice discrepancies he could not explain. Accounts balanced in ways that did not match his expectations. Shipments arrived earlier or later, depending on decisions he had not authorized. Labor productivity exceeded predictions despite rigorous oversight. He began to suspect the young man's involvement, though he lacked evidence, and his attempts to monitor him became more invasive. The quiet, calculated movements of the young man, previously unnoticed, now carried the weight of suspicion. Though he never acted in ways that could be directly condemned, he remained a shadow in the system, an unseen force that altered outcomes without being seen as the cause. Through all of this, he maintained his focus, his calm, and his patience. He did not act out of arrogance or rebellion but out of necessity, understanding that intelligence alone was both a gift and a danger in a world built to suppress it. Every observation, every calculation, every prediction was deliberate. Each small adjustment, each unspoken suggestion, was part of a larger strategy to navigate the plantation's complex web of control, while protecting the lives of those around him. And as he continued to move through this delicate balance, he became aware that his intelligence, so often tested and underestimated, had become the single most powerful force on the estate.
The weight of observation grew heavier with each passing day, pressing on him not as a burden but as a lens through which every detail became meaningful. Every sound, every gesture, every pattern of movement across the estate spoke to him in ways invisible to others. He could feel the rhythm of labor in the fields, the cadence of the overseer's commands, the subtle exchanges of glances among the workers. These were not merely actions to him, they were data points, threads in an intricate web that mapped the pulse of the plantation. Where others saw routine, he perceived interconnections, dependencies, and weak points. Where others saw obedience, he discerned hesitation, adaptation, and silent resistance. The estate itself was alive to him in a way it was not to anyone else. and understanding it became both a survival mechanism and a source of power. He wielded quietly, deliberately, and without alerting those who might seek to punish him for possessing it. At dawn he moved through the quarters with the same calculated grace he applied to every task. He observed the workers waking, noting their moods, the ways their bodies moved after sleep, the subtle tensions that lingered from yesterday's labor or yesterday's threat. Some were exhausted, others carried a restless energy, hints of rebellion, or unspoken questions that had no safe outlet. He did not judge them, he catalogued them. He listened to the whispered plans, the soft fears, and the occasional joke that dared to skirt danger. Every piece of information allowed him to anticipate actions, to guide decisions, and to protect those who depended on him without drawing the attention of the master or the overseer. His intelligence was invisible in its execution, yet it shaped the world around him in profound ways, producing outcomes that could not be attributed to chance alone. The ledger, memorized months earlier, returned constantly to his thoughts, intertwining with the immediate concerns of the knowledge of hidden transactions, coded shipments, and secret alliances, informed his understanding of the broader network in which the plantation existed. He could predict arrivals, departures, and adjustments to plans before anyone else knew they had occurred. He could determine which overseers were likely to act impulsively, which shipments could be rerouted safely, and which workers might inadvertently expose him through fear or curiosity. Every calculation was a blend of observation, logic, and memory, a combination that rendered him nearly untouchable despite the constant surveillance imposed by the master. Outside the main estate, rumors continued to grow. Neighboring plantations spoke quietly of the intelligent man whose presence altered everything, though no one fully understood how. The stories varied. Some described his uncanny memory, others his strategic mind, others his ability to predict events before they occur. Exaggeration only increased the weight of attention, drawing curiosity, fear, and awe from across the region. Men who considered themselves powerful became unsettled, aware that someone they could not control existed in plain sight. Workers who had never seen him directly believed in his abilities and felt emboldened, even if only in small ways, by the mere knowledge of his existence. Within the estate, the dynamic continued to shift. The overseers became increasingly desperate to assert authority, their frustration growing each time outcomes did not align with their expectations. Orders were repeated, punishments intensified, and surveillance heightened, yet each effort failed to restore the absolute control they once exercised. Their inefficiency and unpredictability only reinforced his understanding of the patterns he observed, allowing him to act preemptively and to guide workers in ways that minimized their exposure to danger. His influence remained subtle, indirect, but undeniably effective. The master himself felt the shift, though he could not name it. Daily operations ran more smoothly in ways he could not explain. Tools were repaired efficiently, crops harvested with fewer losses, livestock tended without error. He watched the laborers, noting their strange composure, their careful cooperation, their willingness to follow instructions he himself had not given. Suspicion grew, but proof eluded him. The young man remained outwardly compliant, obeying rules and performing labor diligently, yet every measure he undertook seemed to carry an invisible weight, bending the structure of the estate without visible force. The master's unease deepened each day, a slow-burning fire fueled by the certainty that control was slipping even as he clung to appearances of authority. Even the household was affected. The daughters who had initially sought to remain detached could not help but be drawn to him in subtle ways. Their attention, carefully concealed, influenced the way they moved through rooms, the words they spoke at dinner, and the choices they made in private moments. The son, increasingly frustrated by his inability to assert dominance, tried more aggressive measures, yet each attempt was met with calmness, patience, or strategic silence. The young man's intelligence had become an unseen force that reshaped interactions throughout the estate, shifting power without violence, without overt confrontation, without the acknowledgement of anyone who might feel threatened by it. Within the quarters, workers began to rely on him more openly, though always in coded or subtle ways to avoid detection. He guided decisions about planting, irrigation, and harvest schedules. He advised on small repairs, the handling of animals, and the distribution of labor. His influence increased efficiency and reduced exposure to punishment while remaining invisible to those who might perceive it as a challenge to authority. Every suggestion, every observation, every quiet adjustment strengthened the network of dependency forming around him, creating a subtle but unbreakable chain of influence that reached across every corner of the estate. The dangers of this power were not lost on him. He understood that intelligence was both a shield and a target. To act too boldly could provoke retaliation, yet to remain silent entirely would allow mistakes and abuses to continue unchecked. Each day required careful calibration, an assessment of the balance between intervention and invisibility, between guiding outcomes and maintaining secrecy. Every decision, even the smallest, carried implications that could ripple outward, influencing the estate in ways that were difficult to predict yet impossible to ignore. Beyond the estate, the network of plantations, traders, and officials continued to operate with complexity that he could now interpret. Connections between shipments, payments, and coded agreements revealed patterns that few others could recognize. By memorizing the ledger, he had gained insight into this system, understanding the interplay of commerce, law, and power that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single plantation. His calculations allowed him to anticipate disruptions, navigate threats, and influence outcomes indirectly, producing results that seemed impossible to those who did not understand the underlying logic. In every interaction, he maintained a calm, deliberate presence. He observed without drawing attention, calculated without hesitation, and intervened only when necessary. Each action was measured to achieve maximum effect with minimum risk. His intelligence allowed him to operate in the spaces between rules, exploiting gaps in understanding, anticipating consequences, and shaping events without leaving evidence of his influence. The estate itself became a laboratory for his abilities, a dynamic system in which every decision could be tested, refined, and leveraged to protect those around him and to maintain a precarious balance of survival and control. Even as the master's suspicion increased, even as the overseers grew more frustrated, even as neighboring plantations whispered and speculated, he remained poised, deliberate, and unshaken. The combination of observation, memorization, and reasoning created a quiet but absolute command over the estate's rhythms, a command that relied not on force, not on intimidation, not on visible authority, but on understanding, foresight, and precision. Every calculation strengthened his position, every success reinforced the subtle web of influence he had built, and every day brought new insight into the complex system of control, labor, and survival that defined the plantation world around him. By the time the master began to suspect the depth of his awareness, it was already too late. The young man's intelligence had quietly transformed the estate, turning obedience into understanding, fear into cautious respect, and chaos into order, guided by a mind sharper than any overseer's whip or the master's command. He had seen the patterns others ignored, predicted the moves of men blinded by pride, and wielded knowledge as a force stronger than change. Stories of his abilities had begun to spread beyond the plantation, whispered in fear and awe across neighboring estates, painting him as a man who could bend the very rules of the world around him. No one had expected a slave to possess such power, power not derived from wealth, status, or brute force, but from the one weapon no oppressor could confiscate, a mind capable of seeing, calculating, and acting with precision beyond imagination. He had become both legend and reality, a force that could not be controlled, a presence that reshaped every life around him without a single overt act of rebellion. His brilliance proved that intelligence could not be chained, that knowledge could outmaneuver tyranny, and that one person, armed with reason and observation, could change the fate of countless others. In the quiet of the night, as the estate slept under a fragile veneer of control, he stood apart, a silent guardian of truth and possibility. Every whispered rumor, every hidden calculation, every carefully executed decision, had brought him to a place where his mind alone was mightier than the strongest iron and sharper than the cruelest wit. And though the world around him clung desperately to the illusion of dominance, it was clear that the impossible had already happened. A slave had become untouchable, not by fleeing, not by fighting, but by thinking, seeing, and understanding in ways that no one had thought possible. The seeds of change were sown, and they would grow in ways that the oppressors could never undo, for intelligence once awakened cannot be chained.